Let's look then at some of the day's stories and how they're being discussed in the world's media. So if we start with one of the main dailies in France, Le Figaro, it reflects on the weekend's protests, the so-called yellow vests. President Macron has announced some concessions, but this paper says the problems that motivated the demonstrators in the first place are still around. Italy, Bloomberg is covering the story of the government's budget showdown with the European Commission. Prime Minister Conte's government claims to have found around €3 billion of funds to reduce its budget deficit. Now in the Middle East and Arab News, which is reporting the latest developments in the Yemen civil war, a UN-backed ceasefire has been agreed, but is taking time to come into effect. The paper says tomorrow is the deadline for firing to actually cease. To Canada next, and The Globe, a Mail newspaper, which is looking at the ramifications of the country's problems with China. It says China's effectively kidnapped 2 Canadian citizens in the country, while Canada considers an extradition request against the executive from Huawei. And finally, here in the UK, of course, we have our own BBC Sport website. It's looking at the Lifetime Achievement Award that was given last night to the tennis player Billie Jean King for her contribution to equality in tennis. Well, Cornelia is back, as promised, Chief Executive of MRL Corporation. So let's get stuck in, Cornelia. You're an economist. You love to talk economics. So we have we've got the best breakfast for you this morning. Le Figaro talks about the yellow jackets. It says the crisis has passed, but the problems remain. That's a hamburger, of course. We'll get Le Figaro for you in a moment, hopefully. So let's take a look at the French paper.
It's actually very true. And your previous guest said the same thing. And if you look at it, it was initially against fuel tax, but it was against minimum wage. There's a lot of people who feel disenfranchised because they work maybe 3 jobs and they can't make ends meet. And that is something that ripples throughout Europe. You know, you see it in Germany, people on Hartz IV.
We're seeing it in the UK.
We think that was one of the reasons, I think, why a lot of people voted for Brexit, you know, because they were so disenfranchised with the ruling classes in Westminster. So we're seeing it everywhere, and he's right. Yes, there's fewer protesters, and Edouard Philippe, the Prime Minister, you know, made a big concessionary speech, as did Macron, and they have now upped the minimum wage. They are up for another nice standoff, like the Italians with the EU in terms of the budget. But still, I mean, will that do the trick of satisfying the discontented?
But what Thomas was describing, my previous guest in Business Briefing, about the fact that you've got the big major cities in France that are doing extremely well, where the wealthy are located, where the jobs are located, and then you've got these rural, smaller towns, etc. You're shaking your head. But before I finish, I just want to sort of, you know, explain that when I was listening to what he had to say, I thought, yeah, you're describing Spain, you're describing Italy, you're describing many countries across
Eastern
Europe.
Germany.
And this is a problem that's been developing for many decades and will become more acute with automation and everything else.
Absolutely. The reason I was shaking my head is, yes, there are the professionals in the big cities, but you go to the banlieue, you go to the outskirts, and you have people who have not been, you know, in work for generations, essentially. So yes, you have that.
The problem is, if you're President Macron or if you're Angela Merkel or whatever, Theresa May, how do you resolve this problem when you have limited resources, and also you have quite a tricky political situation in the sense that his approval ratings are pretty low right now.
And there's something else that comes into the French scenario. He has come in with a new movement and basically displaced all the existing parties. So basically there is no real opposition in parliament. So that actually gives the Gilets jaunes
on the street.
Exactly, that's what I wanted to say. That gives them more legitimacy, because other people who might have fought some things in Parliament, let's say the socialists, they may be more enticed to joining the thought process of the guys in the street.
But in order to resolve the kind of issues that we're discussing here, and in any country across Europe, and not just Europe, I would imagine, it's you have to have very, very long-term thinking, don't you?
And politicians
in terms
don't do
of policy.
that.
Well, they don't get re-elected in order to do it.
But look, there's one very good example, which was Gerhard Schröder, the German chancellor, who had this Hartz IV reform, which set Germany up to succeed. It got him out of office, but he had some really far-reaching reforms that set the country up to succeed. So most politicians won't do that.
They either won't or they can't, because they won't necessarily get re-elected, or there isn't that political stability to mean that they're there long enough to do the job.
I would say Macron is actually in a very good space in Parliament, and that's why he attempted the reforms, because he essentially doesn't have an opposition in Parliament, but the opposition then went on the streets.
Indeed, and he's had to change his policies, which is really, really interesting. Let's now then move on to Italy, which is a very similar scenario. So this is Bloomberg reporting on what ANSA is saying in Italy, that they've come to some sort of deal. The Italian government has managed to come up with something that may be palatable to Brussels. This is about its budget.
Well, yeah, but it isn't. It reduces the budget deficit from 2.4 to 2.04%, and the previous government had something below 1%. And the issue here is that, according to the EU, you are allowed to have a GDP to overall government debt of 60%. Italy is at a whopping 132%. So it's just the only one that's worse is Greece. So in order to reduce the budget, they would need to do more. But then again, you had the worst of all worlds. You have populists, you have the Movimento 5 Stelle, who are more left-wing, and you have the Lega, who is more right-wing. And the right-wing ones pushed through their tax reforms, so less taxes, and the left-wing ones pushed through their minimum wage and so on with them, so more expenditure. So that's where it went off kilter. So let's hope that they can come to a resolution, but it's going to be a tough one. And now France is following on their heels.
But quite interesting, yeah, France is following their heels, and quite interesting, you know, the economists that I've interviewed about Italy, because obviously this story has been going on for a couple of months now, most of them say, of course, that, you know, the budget as it was looking like at that point was putting them in a direct confrontation with Brussels. There could be fines, etc., etc. But all of them as well seem to think and agree that actually the ideas on the table weren't going to help the Italian economy anyway.
No, it's not.
So these proposals by this newly elected government actually won't necessily boost the Italian economy anyway.
If you look at the forecast of several economists, it comes to about 0.1% growth of GDP. So it puts you out of kilter in terms with the EU, and at the same time it doesn't do anything for you. But that is what happens when you have it wasn't about the budget, it's about how can the Lega and the Five-Star Movement find a consensus.
Yeah.
That's what this is essentially about.
OK, let's now move on to the Middle East. And front page of Arab News today, it talks about tomorrow, Tuesday deadline for ceasefire in Hodeidah, the main port in Yemen. Just talk us through this article here on the front page of Arab News. Of course, this Saudi-backed paper. Are we hopeful that we will see this ceasefire tomorrow, do we think?
I hope so. I mean, I hope so. But there's many things that can get it off kilter, and we may see a ceasefire for a short time, and then one of the two parties does something stupid and we're back in full-fledged war. But we have to be, I mean, we have to hope, because if you look at the port of Hodeidah, that's where all the UN help gets in, and people are starving. So you need to let the UN help in. The coalition, the Saudi-backed coalition, has also a point that a lot of the arms from Iran for the Houthi rebels get in here. So let's hope it happens, and let's hope it stays. But I'm not that optimistic.
All right, we shall keep a very close eye. Now, Globe and Mail, this is an interesting story. Their editorial, the end of the Trudeau government's China delusion. What
it was
does it
a
mean by that?
strong
I mean,
editorial.
yeah, no, it is a very strong editorial, but we like those. We like to talk about them. I mean, what are they saying in this editorial?
Well, they're saying, look, if you think, you need to understand that China is a police state, it's not a democracy, and they're showing their true colors now. So in any agreement you
with
do...
With the detainment of two Canadian diplomats.
Exactly. What happened is that Meng Wanzhou, who was the CFO and daughter of the founder of Huawei, was detained because of an extradition order from the US. And it says, Trump or no Trump, we're always close to the US. And it's a police state, China. And they're right. I mean, we are a little bit delusionary. China is not a Western democracy. I mean, they're doing a lot of the right things on the environment and so on, but they're a democracy, they're not.
Very quickly, because we're running out of time, Billie Jean King, are you a fan? She got a Lifetime Achievement Award last night at the BBC Sports Personality of the Year.
The woman won 39 Grand Slams.
She was a pioneer and
Absolutely.
a trailblazer on so many levels.
She's founded the Women's Tennis Association, and her equal pay, her epic match with Bobby Riggs in 1973, which was about equal pay. She was way ahead of her time.
But she paid quite a big price as well, though. Personally, it wasn't easy to be a trailblazer.
No, but it never is.
Thanks, Cornelia.
Thank you.
Good to see you. Thank you.